Hey guys, welcome back. BDCKR here. We're back with Season 10, Episode 9 of our weekly Q&A video/podcast on YouTube and a lot of major podcasting platforms. Links in the description to those if you're currently on YouTube. I don't know if this is worth mentioning as housekeeping, but we have a illness. I don't know what to call it exactly. It's not exactly a scare. It's a potential COVID positive test, so we're both masked up for this, just to be cautious, and we're kind of limiting our.
So you might hear difference, but I think it'll depend on what the post production effect has on it.
Yeah, so the only reason we're even mentioning it is because it might show up sounding a little different.
Right, and it's not our usual where I screw up the post production sound.
Yeah.
Adjustments. So yeah. Oh, and I guess other housekeeping too. We're not going to be able to do things properly the same way next week, and we'll mention it more in the weekly recap because that's where it's going to show up. But next week's weekly recap, we have a few ideas about how to manage it. One possibility is doing some ahead of time, at least the talk about the challenge character and the multiplayer reward, and we'll only get screwed up that way if the cycles deviate, which they haven't for a few years.
Yeah.
So we'll see.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah. And maybe something next week, maybe not. It'll depend on how far ahead we can get and whether we've got the time between now and then to film something extra. Because I don't know if we've talked about our workflow before, and we usually do these videos the day of.
Yeah.
And so there's not a lot of post-production. We do it, sync it, and then upload it maybe like an hour after we've done it.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll see.
Yeah.
Experiment. Okay.
Fingers crossed. Anyways, our first question of the week is sort of a continuation from last week. It's two things. So it's K31Wiz, and they say, thank you for your response. Detailed as always. You're right on the topic of citizenship. This is our discussion talking about sort of Russian citizens versus the Russian government and how we often ascribe sort of almost like responsibility on like a citizen level for like the actions of like governments and like larger affiliated groups.
Right.
And so they say, I want to feel patriotic and show my belonging to a country, but now it feels very wrong. You can guess by the way I'm saying those things what my stance on the war is. The government does not and cannot represent each of its citizens, but for foreigners, the government's actions is the most general and obvious way to form an opinion on citizens of this country, which I know is wrong, but we all know happens. As of the video/podcast discussions, I definitely watch my own videos back, not for injustice-related reasons, but to see if there are any technical difficulties in things with my own presenting skills that I can fix. But from time to time, I notice myself being wrong in certain injustice-related things, which also helps me gradually improve. At least I hope so. I think you skipped my Master's Death Cart / Ghul Scimitar question. I hope you'd answer it in the next episode. Thanks. And so we don't accidentally skip parts of it again, I'm going to save that question until after. We'll talk about this one a little bit first, but we did totally skip by it.
Yep.
As I'm sure we often do.
And I've got lots of thoughts on that, actually. But what I think is interesting is the idea about listening back to learn something from it. Like there's a mindfulness there. I think a lot of things where you want to improve, it's partly like there's the Malcolm Gladwell thing where he talks about just is it 10,000 hours?
Yeah.
And what people miss when they just quote the 10,000 hours is it's got to be mindful, because you could just put in time without thinking about it, and 10,000 hours will pass like nothing.
Yeah,
but it doesn't mean you get good at it.
It's really easy to do a thing over and over again. I think it's when you look at the difference between, you know, maybe somebody like a teen who like plays a lot of video games like just for fun.
Right.
And then you look at sort of somebody who maybe puts the same amount of time into games and then becomes like a speed runner or like an esports player or like a competitive player or something, right? Where they end up operating at a high level. And I think there's kind of two things. There's the doing the thing, and there's a certain amount of learning and like a learning curve that happens just from doing the thing.
Right.
But then there's looking at it and taking a step out and saying, if I want to be good at it, especially when it's something that you're doing for fun, there's that like, what can I do to be better at it?
Right.
And so I think you need to, more than just enjoy what you're doing, I think you need to be at least a little ambitious about it. And I think that's like how you can learn faster and get the most out of your time and get better, and there's different ways of doing that. And I think going back through it, I mean, we used to spend more time on what we were doing, go back through the content more, think about it, right? There was more editing sometimes. Or
at some point there was less.
At some points there was less, some points there was more, but when there was not editing, there was a lot more sort of pre-prep work in setting out what the actual like video was. It would either be work in the edit, or it'd be sort of planning work for like what we were going to like show and do and all of that stuff, right. And so I think that, and I think we also learned a lot. I think our stuff, for how, you know, still relatively rough around the edges it is now, was definitely has definitely grown since we started making it. And I think what we've found right now is a place where we have optimized for what is really easy, and we're not really making that much of an effort to sort of learn or grow our skills.
It's what we're capable of, like what fits into our life right now that allows us to keep doing this. Yeah,
because right now we've sort of purely optimized it for personal enjoyment and sustainability. So it's like it's what makes sense and what's easy to do and what we like, instead of, you know, growing and getting better.
Well, I have ideas too, right? Like all of this is predicated. I think the good point that Mark makes is that there's got to be certain self-awareness. Yeah. Because if you can't look at it, like, it's the same ability, I think. All right, so maybe this is a common enough experience when people go to school, they write an essay and it looks good to them. Yeah. I think the pivot, the real key for when you get good at writing and being good at revising your own stuff is to be able to take that step back and look at what you're doing with as if you were not yourself, like with a third party kind of perspective. Because if you don't get that, then you can't really see where you could improve, what you're doing well. Yeah. And you end up just, I don't want to say floundering. You end up just doing, like, going through the motions. Yeah. And I think especially when you're early in your process of working on stuff, this sort of framework, the most recent exposure I had to it was an article that Doc Burford wrote on Medium about this sort of idea of like taste versus skill. And I think when you're familiar with like a medium, like, and I think for things like YouTube videos, most people are, right? They are making videos because they've seen other people make videos and they're like, I think I could do that. Right. Oftentimes, especially when you're starting out, you don't do a great job. And that doesn't even mean that like your stuff is bad. It just means that like you have a vision in your head and what comes out is not as good as you want it to be. It's not, it's not as aligned with your vision as you could potentially, because that's where the skill comes in, right? Like, you have an idea, and the more practice you get, the more skilled you get, the closer your output is to your idea. Yeah. And then when you get to that level, then you can judge whether your original idea was any good. And not just you, but other people who see what you do. And when there is that gap between your skill and your vision, you're right. You can't tell whether the vision was any good or not, because people have to make a lot of assumptions to figure out what you actually intended. Yeah, but the good thing about that is that the gap is actually important, and understanding that the gap is there and what the gap is a good sign, because if you can see it and you want to, you can work on it and get better. So if your taste is better than what you're making, that's a good sign. If you make something, if you make your first thing and you think, this is exactly what I wanted it to be, it's perfect. Yeah. Then you don't really get better. Right? You need to be able to see why you're doing like not as good of a job as you could be. And as long as you can see that and see how, then you can still get better at it. And it's something completely separate from being popular. Yeah. Right? Like, because we know, at least I do, for a lot of the content, I mean, I love reading books. There are some books that just never reach their audience. Some TV shows that never reach their audience. They're amazing media. They're amazing content. But there's just so much that's vying for our attention that it's no fault of the great book that people haven't discovered it, because there's just too much noise. Yeah, I think with a lot of like media products, there's like two separate things that somebody needs to be good at for them to reach like sort of full success. And one thing that a lot of people think is the thing that you need is quality. If you do a really good job, that is the only requisite for success, right? But I think there's something to do with like marketing, with understanding the algorithm, understanding how to get your thing in front of people. Right. That is like an entirely separate skill from quality. And sometimes just getting it in front of people
can be more important than quality.
Right.
You know, I'm not criticizing people who do it, but there are like YouTubers who make content for like tweens and kids, right? Who have really engaging, sort of extroverted, like excitable, like personalities.
Right.
And their content is like totally nothing. Like, it's not awful. It doesn't have to be, you know, offensive or super exciting or whatever, but they have the right personality to just kind of talk in the right way to keep like their like demographics, like engagement up, and it's totally separate from the quality of their content. And so they're skilled. I think, you know, some people like look at that stuff and then go like, oh, this video is terrible, these people are, you know, bad YouTubers, not good at anything, how are they so popular? And it's because their skill is engagement and it's not quality.
Sure. And I'm gonna maybe make a minor sort of distinction. There's different axes that you can judge, right? And so I think maybe your expectation of content is higher or more discriminating than the people who it's targeted for. So there's going to be lots of, you know what it's like? It's like when you're in school and when you're young, you might believe that doing well in school means that you have to be, doing the best in school means you have to be really smart.
Yeah.
And you learn as you get older that there's maybe a level of intelligence, however you want to measure it. We've had this discussion before about what intelligence really is and what it isn't. But however you measure it, the threshold of intelligence is actually pretty low. Once you've reached above that level, then there's other factors that are in play that can be the difference between doing okay in school or doing really well. And I think that's the same thing with the content, where your expectations are maybe something new, something interesting, something, you know, whatever your expectation of content is. Whereas the people who are watching those videos, there's clearly enough of change in the content that they're willing to watch the next video.
Yeah.
But it's more important for them to have what feels like, for example, a parasocial relationship with somebody who is the kind of person that's producing that video.
Yeah. No, so that's fair. I think I agree with that. Because I think when I sort of had to grow out of this phase, I think a little myself, when I was looking at stuff that really didn't appeal to me, especially popular stuff, and going, there's nothing good about this, right? Or like the person making this is making crap, like anybody can make it, right? And I think it's not true. I think it in a lot of ways is related to that sort of bigger like conversation that we have about intelligence, where like I personally think that it's not that intelligence doesn't correlate with a lot of stuff. I just don't really think it's real. And in like most circumstances, I don't think it's like a meaningful measurement tool for something. I think it's this really broad, super, super overarching idea, and it's going to correlate with a bunch of different stuff, right? But I think when you actually think about what matters in your day-to-day life, there's always something specific that's more important. When you're in school, how smart you are doesn't matter. It's how, you know, able you are oftentimes to absorb information and throw it back in a certain way. And so in an individual class, how smart you are doesn't matter. It's your ability to sort of memorize information and then recall information in the way that that particular teacher wants you to. In, you know, your work, no matter how, like, quote unquote, smart you need to be for a job, if you're a rocket scientist, right? Your job requires you to do a specific subset of things. Maybe it's like work with certain calculations. Maybe it's like spatial reasoning. And those, you know, measures are what matters to you in your life. And like intelligence is never, in any circumstance for any person, the most relevant thing to measure. It's just something really broad enough that if you kind of squint your eyes, you can pretend it sort of fits everywhere.
So this is, I'm again, connections in my head. So it's like a lot of other things where we have expectations of what things should be, and they're not really. So the good example I can think of is Keanu Reeves. Keanu Reeves has had a reputation at times of not being a very good actor. Yeah. And people used to complain about him and rag on him and say, how does he keep on getting work? And what people don't realize, or people who were saying that didn't realize or didn't acknowledge, is that there's a threshold. There's a minimum threshold where you need to be good enough. You don't have to be the most brilliant actor, but you need to be good enough for the role. You need to look right for the role. And even more importantly, because it's a part that we don't see, when you make a movie, there's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of people who rely on you. If you are difficult to work with, at some point, there's that cost benefit analysis where is it worth getting that slightly better performance and have to deal with all these cost overruns, these aggravations, these arguments, this difficult to work with, and a lot of times it's not. And the one thing that I've heard about Keanu Reeves is he's amazing to work with.
Oh yeah, he is. According to like everybody, he's a super pleasant coworker.
Yes,
and a really hard, dedicated worker.
He's a professional.
Yeah,
like he takes his job seriously. He does what he does well. He's there when he's supposed to be. He's prepared. So, and again, it reminds me of this other thing where, with a job, like I think there's like 3 axes, right? It can be, you can, if you're producing commercial art, that either you can have it really amazing,
yeah,
really cheap, and on time. 2 out of 3.
Yeah.
Pick 2 out of 3, and that's the only thing you get.
So
if you want it to be really, really good, is it cheap? Then you're not going to get it on time. Like there's sort of, I guess it's very rare that you're going to get everything that's going to appeal to everybody.
Yeah.
So I guess it's more unusual than not when you have somebody like, say, Taylor Swift.
Yeah.
Who is super popular, has a great fan base, but then you've got people who are, picking on her for whatever imagined deficiency she might have because she's not perfect, and somehow it's cool to pick on, like, it's what's that
I need any description of it to
I know
you.
When you don't like something just because it's popular,
like kind of being like a hipster.
Yeah, well, exactly. Like there's a hipster, there's a segment of the population that are just hipster, and they are just happy to dislike things that are popular, and that's sort of the extreme of that, where because it doesn't appeal to them for whatever minimal reason, hipsters are sort of the extreme negative manifestation of that. But I mean, there's lots of stuff you don't have to like. It just, like you said earlier about taste, it just isn't for you.
Yeah. Okay, I have one last sort of thing, which I'm going to try to articulate. It is relevant. I think it wraps up a lot of what we're talking about, but it's also a little bit of a tangent. So, if you wouldn't mind. Because I think, and this is something that I've thought about like a decent amount, I think a lot of what we're talking about here is the idea of like specificity and categorization and how we sort of represent reality in our heads, right? And so just follow me for 1 minute, because I think you can go really, really broad with how you categorize things. And I'm going to actually come back to the example of the comment, right? We're talking about sort of Russian citizens versus the Russian, like, sort of state actions. And so everything in your head is sort of a balancing act between having the most possible information and having information that's easy for us to handle and do something in our heads about. And so, for example, with, Russia, and we can zoom all the way out and think about Russia as like one big entity, where there's Russia and there's everybody inside it. There's all the citizens, there's like the government, there's the land, and it's all one thing.
One organism, one huge organism with little parts that are part of it.
Okay. That's like sort of one unit that we have our thoughts about.
Okay.
And then we can think about sort of the state and like the larger bodies in it, and then we can go like smaller and think about the citizens. And then for us, for example, we can look at Mark, because we know Mark as a commenter and we've seen his comments. And so the level of fidelity of information is that we can go from really big to really, really small and specific. But because most people don't know Mark, right? When you have your first interaction with somebody and the thing you know about them is Russian, you kind of have to zoom out a little bit and you use one of those sort of higher levels of thinking. And I think that's where people end up getting lumped in, because people have sort of, and I think the other place that this comes up a lot in discussion right now is like talking about like gender and gender expression,
racism, misogyny, all those kind of biases. But I think it's really easy to talk about in terms of gender, because there's the sort of like big overarching, to make it really easy to work with stuff in your head. The simplest model is there are 2 genders. There is male and female, and that is the same as man and woman, right? And that's the easiest way to sort of crunch the numbers in your head. It's the easiest thing if you have like, a research paper, if you're trying to do data analysis, right? It's fitting things into boxes in a really simple way makes things easy. And then it makes the work easy, but the results less accurate. Yeah, but it doesn't reflect reality. So you've gone broad instead of accurate. And you can go all the way down to like the most granular level of accuracy, which is, different cultures and countries have different ways of being like manly,
masculine and feminine differ from culture. So,
Okay.
you know, somebody who's like a really manly dude in one country might act very differently from somebody who's really manly somewhere else. There's like sort of ideas about what like a man can and can't do,
Okay.
even, you know, in America, in the Deep South. So if you want to be really broad as you can and make it really easy to process, you say there's two genders, gender and sex are the same, whatever. And if you want to be really specific, you have to say this person is masculine presenting from the way that masculinity works in, you know, the southern United States in this like state, and like that person's like expression of masculinity is different. So even people who identify as the same gender all have a little bit different gender expression for each other.
Right.
But if you're working that specifically, then you can never process that information because no two people are in the same category, right? Everybody's a little different.
Right.
And so everybody kind of has to, in their day-to-day life, pick a level complexity that they're willing to work with.
Right.
And so I think a lot of the time with a lot of these sort of like societal level like biases and issues,
Right.
and these discussions around them, you run into this issue of people sort of picking different points of like how simple to complex they want to make the world. And then the real issue is when people point at it and they say, I want to think about the world in a really simple way. And that is exactly what reality is.
Right. Yeah, that's such a good point, because as you're saying that, the thought that keeps popping in my head is, if that's how you interact with the world, most of the time that's going to be okay, as long as you're able to acknowledge that that's a simplification of what it really is. Because somebody who's actually dealing with it in the world in all its complexity, that's going to be accurate.
Yeah.
It's going to be a little bit overwhelming. And it's always the simplification part that gets you into trouble. And if you're willing to acknowledge it, or at least recognize it, then somebody who does that would at least be able to pivot on the point without actually running into trouble.
Yeah, because like less than 1% of people are trans, right? From our understanding right now.
Yeah, but is it going to be like where a tiny percentage of people were left-handed until they stopped demonizing them?
Yeah.
And treating them like the devil spawn?
But whether or not that's right, let's just pretend it is, right? That means if you just assume that, you know, the world works like male and female, and whatever sort of your chromosomes are is what you actually are, even though we know that
that's not true.
Is not true.
Right.
If you pretend that that's true, 99% of the time, you'll be right.
Or not necessarily right so much as you'll be interacting with the world in a way that doesn't create friction.
Yeah, not you're right, but like your assumption about the world won't be proven wrong, I guess.
Right.
Yeah. But then in that, like, you know, 1% of the time that you're wrong, you just gotta own up to it. You gotta say, I'm using a simple way of looking at the world. It's not always true.
Yeah.
And you have to be willing to sort of change where your needle's pointing for broad to specific. And that's kind of how I feel about, like, when we talk about, like, the Russian thing. When we talk about intelligence, I feel like talking about, like, intelligence and IQ is the broadest version, where you're taking a blurry snapshot of, like, somebody's total sort of capacity to, like, do stuff.
Right.
And it's so broad that it almost doesn't matter, even though it will sort of correlate to stuff. There is sort of, if you squint, it feels like it maybe maps onto stuff in the real world.
Right.
But you've gone so broad that for an actual person standing in front of you or an actual situation, it's never sort of the right information to look at, in my opinion.
Right.
Yeah. So that's
interesting.
That's my big thought. I don't know if that came across well. Hopefully people get what I'm saying.
I get it.
Yeah.
That's what matters.
Okay, very
For the number of people that are going to actually watch this, I think it matters more that we understand what we're saying.
Yeah, so let's move on to maybe the second part of K31 Wiz, or this is Keywiz 31. This is Mark.
So this is Mark's
separate.
I guess he's got 3 different accounts, at least.
This was the second account because his comment was not going through properly, so he's testing if it would show up on a different account.
Right.
And so we got this one. And so Mark says, also wanted to ask a little other thing. So K-Real, you probably heard of him, and I look at his way of playing many times to learn. He uses Totem and Scimitar on his Special 2 Specialist as a way of getting 2 bars of power, and most of the time has Astro Harness as the 3rd gear. Use the setup with the Master Death Cart and Power Generating Gear. I don't have any of the Power Generating Gears on the account I'm playing on now, neither do I have Astro Harness, but Scimitar I do have. So what is your opinion on that? Why you use your Special 2 characters the way you do, and what positives/negatives you see in those different setups.
All right, so, boy, a bunch of stuff. This is such a... It's funny that we missed it last time, because it's such a loaded question. There's so many parts that I love and I want to address. So, the mention of power generating gears as a third gear. Now that I've been playing so much more with and forcing myself to play with all the different challenge characters, not all the ones that are in the rotation.
Most.
A lot of them, yeah, most. But even like it's only 40 something, and we're missing 23, so like 2/3.
Yeah.
So I'm actually of the mind now that the best third gear for most cases is either Enchantress Companion Gear or Claw of Horus on your Tentu Totem Master's Death card. And there's a lot of reasons why, and I can get into that's for another video. But we started doing with the power generating gears because it made it easier against power dampening teams, and it was the difference between getting full 2 bars or not, and needing to do a swipe combo, for example, to get the full 2nd bar of power. So I've actually changed my thoughts based on that. So Totem and Scimitar, you tag in, it guarantees you the 2nd bar because each one gives you a bar of power, and that works fine for your first hit. The problem becomes, is there a situation where Totem and Scimitar, you don't get your power back? And there are lots. So there's lots of characters with Revive on the opponent side. There are lots of characters now, or teams that have Astro Harness. And if your Special 2 is not one hit, and there's very few that are one hit, and you end up triggering an invulnerability and they don't get knocked out. If when they revive, you don't get your power back because you don't finish knocking them out. So then that becomes another issue on your side. So if we're talking opponents revive, your character that you're using for your Special 2 specialist, if they are one of the later characters that are high damage and you can only knock out the opponent on the last hit, then you are going to not get your power back when they do a revive. So it happens often enough that once you lose that, and if your entire strategy, your team strategy is predicated on the Special 2 specialist, then you're going to have to tag out, back in, that's 1 bar, maybe futz around a bit to get your 2nd bar, or if it takes too long, tag out again and tag back in. So I know that there's been a trend in the last couple of years that was popularized by Scopos Gaming, and he's introduced the idea of a carry, and the carry is an unbalanced team. One character is stronger than everybody else by a lot. They do all the damage. So if you're going to be using a carry and having both power generating gears on the one player, like it just makes sense, because if you say you split them because you want somebody else to have it, what you've done is you've given a bunch of the power to somebody who's going to be a lot weaker. And it's not going to be nearly as effective. So the one advantage of Master's Death Card and 10-2 on the same character is, for every single time that you do a Special 2 that doesn't knock out the opponent, it could be something as simple as blocking, right? If you screw up the timing, it doesn't mean that your strategy is bad. It might mean that your execution is bad. So if you screw up one time and they have Astro Harness, or they block your special, or they have a revive and they survive whatever it is, they survive your Special 2, you're wasting a lot of time.
Yeah.
And if you have Master's Death card, then it's just 1 tag out and tag back in instead of 2 tags back in. I can never remember where to put the S on tag out and tag in. Tag outs, tags out.
Tag ins and tag outs, I think.
Okay. So you end up just wasting a lot more time. Now, not to say that there aren't strategies where if you have a secondary character, so if your team is more balanced, and 2 of your 3 characters have a lot of offensive potential, which is the way I like it, then one person could have Master's Death card, another could have Tentu Totem, but then you really need to decide how much you're going to rely on one versus the other, because a character coming in with repeated Special 2s is clearly going to do way more damage than most characters that come in for a Special 1. And that's why you'll see also in the last, I guess, few months, where I've really gravitated towards having Hawkgirl on pretty much every team, because it speeds up the tag-ins and tag-outs, and so you get the benefit of Master's Death card and Tentu Totem so much more often. What else? Because, all right, so when you think about Scimitar, it's 1 bar, 1 time. That's it. Like, if you're, a lot of the other effects are going to be like with I think the boosted basic damage. I can't remember. It's been so long since I used Scimitar. And the power drain on the tap combo.
Mm-hmm.
I'm doing as little basic damage as I can on my specialist. Mm-hmm. I'm not worried about that. So the other effects don't come into it as much. So basically, I've got that 1 bar power, and then I'm done. That gear slot is kind of, I don't want to say wasted, but it's done.
Mm.
Master's Death Card it's a gift that keeps on giving.
Yeah.
So reliability, is that the answer? The short answer, the too long didn't read answer is reliability is what I like about it. It keeps the fights more consistent. Oh, you know what? I'm going to show you a team this Thursday.
Yeah.
On the weekly recap where Tanty Toto and Master Death Card are split up.
Okay. That's your promise, and that's something
to
look forward to?
A couple days.
Okay, cool.
And there's going to be a specific reason for it, because this team is really good. And part of the reason is that by being a specialist,
yeah,
you don't need to go to a special 2 to do a huge amount of damage.
Okay.
And it'll be a bit of a cheat, and you'll see what I mean when we get to it.
Okay, very cool. I know we only answered stuff from one commenter this week, and we didn't answer that many questions, but I think this is probably as good a point as anywhere else to end off the video.
Yeah.
With sort of a teaser for...
And so, I usually like to do this at the beginning, but I'm just going to comment a bit on the video that's playing in the background as you watch, or as you listen to the questions and our answers.
So now you'll be able to recontextualize what you just saw.
Sure. Who was this week's challenge? I think is it Regime Hot Girl? It must be Regime Hot Girl. And so what's amazing about this team and why there's such a great synergy is that I totally underestimated Regime Hot Girl's disabling specials temporarily when she tags in.
Mm-hmm.
There is an elegance to this team with Rebirth Raven and Regime Hawk Girl and Hawk Girl Prime to let you swap in and out as fast as you can so that you can do stuff, is that you tag in Regime Hawk Girl and disable the opponent's specials.
Mm-hmm.
They don't get to use their power. Then you tag in Rebirth Raven and then you take it from them before they've even had a chance to undisable, and you can just steal it. It feels so wrong because they can't use their power. It almost feels like it's not there. And then you can tag in back and forth fast enough that they never get to use their power, and you just keep on bombing them. And you don't even have to worry about landing a special unblocked because they're just not generating power. Or if they are generating power, you just take it. And that takes away the fear of even, say, the uncommon but quite possible, not rare, Blackest Night Flash team, where if you want to do a little bit of damage over time, go ahead. Mm-hmm. Just more power to steal from Rebirth Raven.
Yeah.
Love this team. A lot of fun. I was surprised at how much I like Regime Hawk Girl the second time around playing with her, because I really felt like the 200% if you giving you automatic crit on her special 2 just wasn't enough, and that the disabling specials didn't do much because it only bought you a few seconds. It didn't give you enough time to do stuff. Well, there's a solution to that. Hawk Girl Prime plus Rebirth Raven means you don't have to. In the time that takes that the passive to expire, I've already tagged in and stolen their power back.
Good stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, very cool. So that will do it for this week. I'm giving myself a pass, a week off for writing something for Eliza, and I'm calling this my bed rest, my mental rest week, because I am looking to not strain myself and to reduce the likelihood of post-acute symptoms, which is just, it's not a great excuse because it wouldn't take me very long and I wouldn't have had to think very hard about something, but I'm playing the COVID, the potential COVID
Play it
card,
while you got it.
Listen, to say I didn't say anything.
I think we as a society, we place too much of a moral value on being productive, on creating value, whether it's monetary or even something that people can measure or see and say, hey, you're contributing something. I think existing has value.
Yeah.
There is a quality in each one of us that justifies our existence.
Yeah.
And I'm happy for you to do a little bit of self-care and not have to worry about producing something.
Yeah, and you know what's great news? I think very few people look at what we've done here today and say we've produced something of value. So we're doing radical anti-capitalism just by making this, because we've made something that is probably not very valuable to very many people.
That's true.
But anyways, there is a list of people who this is demonstrably valuable for, and we'd like to give a massive thank you to those people. Those are the people who have at some point supported us on Patreon.
Right.
So,
and those people are Alexis M, who's supporting us on the Your Message Here tier, Michael Devries, Irvin Ruiz, and Hoshi 127, who are supporting us on the credited level. And also on the screen is a list of people who have been generous enough to have supported us at some point during this pandemic.
There we go. Thank you so much for your support, and we'll see you next time.
Komoda.